On a night in the spring of 1967, on a trail in the mountains of the Central Highlands, a North Vietnamese soldier named Hue stopped walking and listened to a sound he had learned to fear more than bombers. It was a small sound. That was the terrible thing about it. Somewhere above the trees, high up and far off, there was a light, thin, buzzing drone. The noise of a tiny single-engine aircraft puttering along in a lazy circle. It sounded like a lawnmower. It sounded like nothing at all. 150 men of Hugh's unit were strung out along that trail beneath it, carrying ammunition south, and every one of them had frozen where they stood. They were not afraid of that airplane. They knew exactly what it was. It was a spotter plane, a light, unarmed, fabric and metal machine that could not have hurt them if it tried. It carried no bombs. It could not strafe them. If it came low enough, a man with a rifle could shoot it down, and men often did. It was the weakest aircraft in the entire American arsenal, and it was, without any question, the single most feared sound in the night sky over Vietnam, because the little plane did not need to hurt them. It had only one job. It looked, and if it had seen them, if the man flying it in the dark at treetop height had somehow picked out a column of men moving under the jungle canopy, then in about 20 minutes, from an airbase they could not see, aircraft that could most certainly hurt them would arrive overhead, and then that stretch of mountain would cease to exist. Hugh could not know that the man in that cockpit was a captain named Ross Gable, 28, from a farming town in Nebraska, flying alone, unarmed, in an aircraft with a lawnmower engine 300 feet above an enemy who wanted very badly to kill him. Hugh knew only the sound and what the sound meant, and it meant something the bombers themselves never had. The bombers came and killed and left, and it was over. This little buzzing thing meant that somewhere up there in the dark, a man was looking at him. And what terrified Hugh, what terrified an entire army, was that the plane never had to fire a shot. Its only weapon was that it had seen you. And that was enough. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why an army that endured the heaviest bombing in history was terrified of a plane that could not shoot at it, you have to understand what that plane actually was. And you have to understand the strange, lonely, insanely dangerous job of the man flying it. To understand the little plane, you first have to understand the biggest problem the Americans had in that war. And it was not firepower. The Americans had firepower beyond anything in history. The problem was much simpler and much harder to solve. They could not find the enemy. Think about the situation from the American side. They had fighter bombers that could level a village. They had B-52s that could turn a square mile of jungle into a moonscape. They had artillery that could put steel on any coordinate in seconds. They had, in raw destructive terms, more power available than any army that has ever existed, and almost all of it was useless, most of the time, because you cannot bomb what you cannot see. And you could not see anything in Vietnam. The jungle canopy was often triple layered, a roof of leaves so thick that a man flying above it saw nothing but an unbroken green carpet, mile after mile after mile. Under that carpet, an entire army moved. Battalions marched down trails invisible from the air. Supply columns moved at night. Anti-aircraft guns were dug in under the trees. Whole base camps existed, with kitchens and hospitals, under a roof of green that hid them completely from the most technologically advanced air force in the world. The North Vietnamese understood exactly what they were doing. Their entire way of war was built around invisibility, move at night, hide by day, stay under the trees, and the enemy's terrible machines cannot touch you. Now add the second half of the problem, which is the one that made it agonizing. A fast jet is a terrible instrument for finding things. A fighter bomber comes over the target at hundreds of miles an hour. The pilot has seconds, literally seconds, to see the ground, identify the target, and put his ordnance on it. He is flying too fast and too high to pick out a camouflage bunker under a tree, or to tell the difference between a farmer's ox cart and a supply column, or to know that the friendly troops are on this side of that ridge and the enemy is on the other. He is a hammer. He is a magnificent hammer, but he cannot find his own nail, and that gap between enormous firepower and near total blindness was where men died. Bombs dropped on empty jungle by pilots who could not see. Enemy units passing under aircraft that never knew they were there. And, worst of all, the nightmare that haunted every commander in that war. Bombs falling on your own men because a jet pilot at 400 knots misidentified the ridge. So the Americans needed something in between. They needed an eye. They needed a man who could get down low and slow and stay there, who could loiter over the jungle for hours, who could learn a piece of ground so well that he would notice when a single thing about it changed, who could find the enemy under the canopy and then, crucially, guide the hammer onto him with precision. They needed someone to be the link between the men on the ground and the fire in the sky, and that job could not be done from a jet. It had to be done from something slow, so they took an aircraft that was almost literally a light civilian plane, and they gave it to some of the bravest pilots of the war, and they sent it out to fly low and slow over an enemy who was desperate to kill it. The aircraft the Americans used for this was, on paper, a joke. The most iconic of them was the O-1 Bird Dog. It was a small, high-wing, single-engine airplane with a fixed landing gear built on a light civilian design, the kind of aircraft you might see at a small rural airfield taking a student pilot up for a lesson. It was made largely of aluminum and fabric. It carried no armor. It was unarmed except, in most cases, for a handful of white phosphorus marking rockets, smoke rockets, not weapons, slung under the wings. It cruised at a speed a fast car could beat on a highway. It had a two-man cockpit with big greenhouse windows, and those windows were the entire point because the pilot's job was to see. Later, there were other aircraft in the same role, the O-2, a strange push-pull twin, and the O-V-10 Bronco, which was faster and tougher and could carry real weapons. But the essential job never changed, and the essential terror it caused never changed either. The core of it was a slow airplane, flying low, with a man in it whose job was to look at the ground. They were called forward air controllers, FACs, and the FAC pilot had, by a wide margin, one of the most dangerous and most strange jobs of the entire war. Here's what he did. He flew alone or with an observer in an unarmed light plane at low altitude, sometimes just a few hundred feet above the trees, over territory absolutely infested with enemy troops who had every kind of weapon, from rifles to heavy anti-aircraft guns. And he did not dart in and out. He loitered. He stayed. He flew slow, lazy circles over the enemy for hours at a time, looking down through those big windows, studying the ground. Understand how insane that is, tactically. Every principle of air survival says, be fast, be high, be unpredictable, and do not linger. The FAC violated all four, deliberately, every single day, because the job could not be done any other way. He had to be slow enough to see, he had to be low enough to see, and he had to stay long enough to be sure. And that meant he spent his working hours as the easiest target in Vietnam, circling patiently over people who wanted him dead more than they wanted almost anything. And here is the skill that made him worth it. AFAC did not just look at the jungle, he knew his jungle. Each FAC was typically assigned to a specific area of operations, and he flew over it day after day, week after week, until he knew that stretch of country better than he knew his own neighborhood back home. He knew every trail, every tree line, every hut, every bend in the river, and that meant he could see change. That is the whole art of it. He would look at a paddy field and know that yesterday there had been no tracks along that dike. He would notice that a particular patch of vegetation was slightly the wrong shade of green because it had been cut and laid over something. He would see a wisp of smoke where no one cooked. He would spot a path of trampled grass that had not been there last Tuesday. He was reading the ground like a hunter reads a forest, and he could do it because he had been staring at the same ground for months. A jet pilot at 400 knots saw green. The FAC at 90 knots saw a story. The things they learned to notice sound almost absurd until you understand the patience behind them. AFAC would spot a trail because the vegetation alongside it was faintly dusty. He would find a truck park because the tree shadows in one patch were a shade too regular, because they were not trees, but cut branches laid over vehicles. He would notice that a stretch of river had a shallow, straight ripple across it at one point, and know that under the water there was a ford made of stones, laid there so trucks could cross without leaving a bridge for him to bomb. He would see a footpath that ended for no reason and understand that it did not end at all. It simply went underground. One classic sign, and every FAC learned it: look for the tracks in the morning dew. In the early light, a column of men crossing a wet field leaves a dark trail behind them, a swathe where the dew has been knocked off the grass. It fades within an hour. But if you are up there at dawn, in a slow plane looking down, that faint, dark line across a field is a message written in the grass, and it says, 100 men walked this way in the night, and they went that direction. The enemy could hide the men. They could not hide what the men had touched, and the FAC was up there every morning looking for exactly that. Now go back down to the trail and stand next to Hio and listen to that little buzzing drone in the dark and understand exactly what it meant to the man hearing it. The FAC did not kill anyone. That is the essential, terrible fact of it. He carried no bombs. His marking rockets were nothing but smoke. If he flew directly over 100 men, he could not have hurt a single one of them. He was, in himself, completely harmless. But he was the trigger for everything else. When a FAC found something, a truck park, a bunker complex, a column of men, an anti-aircraft position, his next move was to reach for the radio. And on the other end of that radio was the entire striking power of the United States. He could call for fighter bombers, and they would come, loaded with high explosive and napalm and cluster munitions. He could call for artillery. He could, on a big enough target, set in motion a B-52 strike, and if that happened, the men below would never even hear the aircraft that killed them. The FAC was one man in a Cessna. Behind him stood the most destructive air force in the history of the world, waiting to be pointed. And then he did the thing that made him the most hated man in the sky. He marked the target. He would tip that little plane over into a dive, low, and fire one of his white phosphorus rockets into the exact spot where the enemy was. The rocket would hit and burst into a brilliant, unmistakable column of white smoke rising out of the jungle. And then he would climb away and get on the radio to the incoming fighters and say, in effect, "Hit my smoke." Imagine being a North Vietnamese soldier hiding in a tree line, hearing that lazy little engine circling overhead, and then hearing it change pitch, hearing it come down, and then seeing a rocket streak out of the sky and slam into the ground 50 meters from where you are lying and burst into a white column of smoke that rises above the trees like a flag. That smoke is not a weapon. It cannot hurt you. It is a signpost, and it is pointing directly at you, and it is telling every fighter bomber in the region exactly where to go. That white smoke was the most terrifying thing many of those men ever saw, because it was the last thing they saw before the world ended. Follow one of those sequences all the way through from the ground, because the timing of it is its own kind of horror. First, there is the buzz. High and thin and lazy. It goes on for a long time. That is the worst part, the waiting. He is up there, circling, and you do not know whether he has seen you, and you cannot move, because movement is exactly what he is looking for. So you lie in the tree line, and you listen to a small engine going around and around above you, and you try not to breathe. Then the sound changes. The engine note deepens and swells as the little plane tips over and comes down. And now it is not lazy anymore. It is coming. And everyone below knows what that means. There's a sharp hiss, and something streaks out of the sky, and it hits the ground near you with a crack. And a fountain of thick white smoke boils up out of the trees, brilliant, unmistakable, rising into the sky like a signal fire. Because that is exactly what it is. Now you are marked. Now the smoke is standing over your position like a flag, and you cannot put it out, and you cannot outrun it, and the little plane is already climbing away, and its pilot is on the radio, and then there is a pause. A minute, maybe two. The buzzing goes back to circling, patient as ever. And in that silence, every man in that tree line knows exactly what is coming and can do absolutely nothing about it. And then, on the horizon, lo, comes a different sound entirely, and the FAC did not leave. This is the detail that separates him from every other aircraft that ever tormented them. The bombers came and went. The FAC stayed. He circled above the strike, watching, correcting, telling the fighters they were 50 meters long, telling them to shift left, sending them back around for another pass, running the whole destruction from his little unarmed plane like a conductor over an orchestra. And when the jets ran out of ordnance and went home, he still stayed, flying over the wreckage, assessing the damage, looking for survivors, looking for what he had missed. He was there before it, during it, and after it. So put yourself in Haiyu's boots on that trail. That thin, buzzing, harmless little engine circling somewhere in the darkness above you meant something no other sound in that war meant. It did not mean death was coming. The bombers meant that, and you could endure bombers because they were random and impersonal, and they either got you or they did not. The little plane meant something far worse. It meant you had been seen. It meant a specific human being up there in the dark had picked you out of an entire jungle and was, at this exact moment, on the radio, giving your position to men who were already taking off. It meant your death was no longer a matter of chance. It had become an appointment. Everything about that sound was frightening in daylight. At night, it became something close to unbearable, and the reason is worth understanding because it goes to the heart of how that war was fought. The night was the North Vietnamese Army's whole strategy. It was the foundation of everything. By day, they hid under the canopy, in bunkers, in the villages, motionless. By night, they moved. That was when the trucks rolled on the trail, when the columns marched, when the supplies went south, when units repositioned for an attack. They had built an entire logistical machine around the simple ancient truth that in the dark, an enemy cannot see you. And the FAC took the dark away from them. The Americans flew night FAC missions, and they were among the most extraordinary flying of the war. Picture it, a man alone in a tiny, single-engine aircraft at night over mountains and jungle, in an aircraft with minimal instruments flying low. There is no horizon, there are no lights on the ground, because everyone below him is running blacked out. The trucks drive without headlights. The men move without lamps. He is flying, essentially, inside a black bag, navigating by dead reckoning and terrain he has memorized, low enough to hit a ridge if he loses track of where he is, and he is hunting. Consider what that flying actually asked of a man. There is no autopilot. There is no ground mapping radar. There is a compass, an airspeed indicator, an altimeter, and a memory. He is threading between mountains he cannot see, in an aircraft with a small engine at night, in weather that can close in without warning. If that single engine quits, there is nowhere to go. No lit runway, no flat field, nothing below but black jungle and the enemy. If he flies into a ridge, no one will ever know exactly what happened to him. And on top of all of that, he is not merely trying to survive the flight. He is working. He is scanning the black ground beneath him, hour after hour, looking for a spark, a flicker, a shape that is slightly wrong, doing detailed observational work in total darkness while flying a light aircraft low through mountains, alone. Pilots who did other jobs in that war, who flew far faster and more glamorous machines, spoke of the night FACs with a particular kind of awe. They understood exactly what it took. There are not many jobs in the history of flight that asked more of a person and gave him less to do it with. What was he looking for? In total darkness. Anything. A flicker of a cooking fire that someone had not covered well enough. The dull glow of a cigarette. The brief flash of a headlight, quickly killed. The pale line of a road, and something moving along it that had not been there 10 minutes ago. Dust hanging in the air where dust should not be. A FAC who knew his ground could look at a black jungle and pick out the one thing that was wrong with it, and he could do it in the dark, at low level, alone. And then he would drop a flare, and the entire world would light up. For the men on the ground, that was the nightmare. You are moving in the dark, doing everything right, under strict light discipline, in a column that has taken every precaution, and you hear the buzz, and you keep going, because you have to, because the supplies must reach the south. And then, above you, a flare cracks open into blinding white light hanging under its little parachute, and you are standing in the open, exposed, blinking, in the middle of what a moment ago was a safe, black night, and you know that somewhere above that light, the man who found you is already on the radio. And so the little plane reached down and rewrote the smallest details of how these men lived. Not through violence, through paranoia, no fires ever, unless they could be dug into a pit and vented through a channel so the smoke came out cold and dispersed. No cigarettes in the open. A lit cigarette can be seen from the air at night from a startling distance. No metal left uncovered because metal catches light. No walking in a straight line across open ground because straight lines are the one thing nature does not make, and a straight line in the grass is a signature. No talking above a murmur. No moving at all when the buzz came near, and this was drilled hardest of all, do not look up. A face turned upward is a pale oval against a dark background, and a pale oval is the easiest thing in the world for a man in a slow plane to see. So they trained themselves to freeze and stare at the dirt while an enemy circled overhead, deciding their fate. Live like that for a week, and it is exhausting. Live like that for years, and many of them did, and it becomes something else. It becomes a permanent, low, grinding pressure that never lifts, a sense of being watched at every hour by something you cannot see and cannot fight. That was the little plane's real weapon, not the rockets. The way it got inside of a man's head and stayed there, they tried everything to stop him. They shot at the FACs constantly. The little planes came home shot to pieces, and many did not come home at all. The loss rate among FACs was appalling, and it is one of the truly undertold costs of the air war. They tried to lure them in. They set up flak traps, positioning heavy anti-aircraft guns around a tempting target and waiting for FAC to come down low to investigate. The flak trap deserves a moment because it tells you how badly they wanted these men dead. They understood the FAC's psychology perfectly. They knew he was curious. They knew that his entire craft was noticing the thing that was slightly wrong and going down for a closer look. So they gave him something to look at. They would leave a truck out in the open, or a suspicious stack of crates, or poorly hidden bunker, something just careless enough to be believable and just interesting enough to be irresistible. And then they would ring it with heavy anti-aircraft guns hidden in the trees and wait. AFAC circling that bait would come down to see it. He would drop low and slow and bank around it for a closer look, and every gun would open up at once from every side at a range where they could not miss. It killed FACs. It killed a lot of them. And the awful thing is that it worked precisely because those pilots were good at their jobs, because a man whose whole purpose is to go and look was always going to go and look. The enemy had turned the FAC's greatest strength into the thing that killed him. And the FACs knew about the traps and went down anyway because the alternative was to stop looking, and if they stopped looking, men on the ground would die. They put bounties out. They enforced brutal, light discipline, ordering their men to endure any hardship rather than show a single spark. And none of it solved the problem, because the problem was not a weapon that could be destroyed. The problem was a man, up there, with a pair of eyes and a radio and an intimate knowledge of the ground. And there was always another one tomorrow. You could shoot down a bird dog and feel a moment of triumph. And the next morning, the buzzing would be back. Now, turn it around and look at the war from inside that tiny cockpit, because the FACs paid for what they did, and the price was terrible. The pilot flying that little plane was one of the most exposed men in the entire war. He had no armor to speak of. He had no speed to run with. He had no weapons to fight back with, beyond a few smoke rockets and sometimes a rifle or a pistol he carried personally. And he was flying, slowly in circles, a few hundred feet above people who had every reason on earth to kill him, and every kind of gun with which to try. He was hit constantly. FAC aircraft came back with holes through the wings, through the fuselage, through the cockpit. Men flew home with their instruments shot out, their controls damaged, their aircraft barely flying. And a great many did not come home to fly a slow, unarmed, light aircraft, low over concentrated anti-aircraft fire, day after day, was among the most statistically dangerous jobs available to an American in that war. And here's the thing that gets me about them. They stayed anyway, because the FAC's real job at bottom was not to find targets. It was to protect the men on the ground. When an American infantry unit was in trouble, pinned down, taking fire from a tree line they could not identify, about to be overrun, the FAC was the man who came. He would come down low over the fight and orbit right over the top of it in the middle of the fire from both sides, and he would sort out the chaos below him. He would find where the friendlies were and where the enemy was, in a fight where those two things might be 40 meters apart. He would talk to the men on the ground on the radio, and he would put his smoke rocket down on the enemy, and then he would bring the fast movers in, sometimes so close to the friendly line that a mistake of a few meters would kill the men he was trying to save. Think about the precision that demanded, and the nerve. He is low, slow, and being shot at. He is talking on two radios at once, to the desperate men below and to the fighters above. He's looking at a jungle where the two sides are almost intermingled. And he has to decide personally exactly where the bombs go, knowing that if he is wrong, he kills Americans. Men did that job for hours at a stretch, and then went back and did it again the next day, and there was a weight on those men that almost nobody talks about. The FAC decided who died, not in the abstract way a general decides, personally and immediately, and by name of coordinate. He looked down at a hut, or a tree line, or a line of shapes moving on a trail, and he made a judgment, enemy or not, and then he put a rocket into it, and men he had never met dropped bombs on the smoke. Sometimes the judgment was easy. A truck park under camouflage is a truck park. Anti-aircraft guns firing at you are anti-aircraft guns. But sometimes it was not easy at all. Sometimes there were figures moving along a trail at dusk, and they might be a supply column, and they might be farmers. Sometimes there was a village where the enemy had been reported, and there were people in it, and the man in the little plane had to decide alone from 300 feet in a few seconds with imperfect information, and then live with what he decided for the rest of his life. That is a burden very few people ever have to carry, and the FACs carried it every working day. Some of them got it wrong. Some of them carried that home. It is the part of the job the stories usually leave out, and it deserves to be said because it was as real as the flak. Infantry units in Vietnam had a particular love for FAC pilots, and it was not sentimental. That little buzzing plane arriving overhead when you were surrounded and losing was one of the best sounds in the world, because it meant the sky was about to come down on the people trying to kill you. Picture one of those from the ground. An American platoon is pinned in a paddy, taking fire from a tree line 60 meters away, and men are being hit, and they cannot move, and they cannot see what is shooting at them. They are losing. They call for air, and they wait, and the fire keeps coming, and there is nothing they can do about it. And then they hear it, a small, thin, ridiculous little engine growing out of the sky, and a tiny plane comes over the tree line, flimsy, unarmed, absurd, flying right into the middle of all of it, and it starts to circle directly above them in the fire, staying, not leaving. A voice comes up on the radio, calm, almost bored. He asks where they are. He asks where the fire is coming from. He tells them to pop a smoke grenade so he can see their line. And the men on the ground who have been dying alone for 20 minutes suddenly have someone up there who can see the whole thing, and who is looking directly at them, and who is not going anywhere. He puts a white phosphorus rocket into the tree line. He tells the fighters coming in from the coast where to put their bombs, 60 meters from Americans, close enough that a small error kills the men he is saving. And then the jets come in, one after another, and that tree line stops existing. And the platoon that was about to be overrun picks up its wounded and walks out. Every one of those men remembered that sound for the rest of his life, and on the other side of the same tree line, so did anyone who survived it. So the exact same sound, the light, thin lawnmower drone of a little plane, was two entirely different things depending on which side of the line you were standing on. To Hugh in the trees, it was the sound of being seen, and it was the worst sound in the world. To a young American on the ground, with his platoon pinned in a paddy, it was the sound of someone up there who could see him and who was coming to help. Same plane, same engine, same man. Two completely different meanings, a few hundred meters apart. Hugh survived that night. The little plane droned on and circled, and eventually the sound faded off toward the east, and no bombs fell, and its column moved on. He had not been seen, this time. But he had stood in the dark for 11 minutes, frozen mid-step on a mountain trail, holding a load of mortar rounds on his back, staring at the dirt and not daring to look up, while a man in a small airplane circled overhead and decided, without ever knowing who existed, whether he would see out the night. Nothing had happened. That was the strange thing. Nothing at all had happened, and it was one of the worst experiences of his life. And here is the part that stayed with him. He never knew. He never knew whether the pilot had looked right at his column and missed it, or had never glanced that way at all, or had seen something and decided it was not worth a strike. He never knew how close it had been. The bombers, when they came, at least told you what had happened. The little plane told you nothing. It just circled and buzzed and left, and you went on down the trail carrying a question you could never answer. He never got over that sound, and neither did his army. The North Vietnamese soldier learned to fear a great many American things. He feared the B-52s, which killed without warning. He feared the gunships that poured fire out of the night. He feared the artillery and the helicopters and the endless material weight of an enemy who could replace everything he lost. But the thing that got into a man's head, that stayed with him and shaped his behavior and made him afraid in a way that lasted, was not the loudest thing in the sky. It was the quietest, because everything else was violence, and violence can be endured. Men can be extraordinarily brave about violence. It is impersonal. It comes, and it does its worst, and if you survive it, it is over. But the little plane was not violence. The little plane was attention. It was the feeling of being watched personally by an intelligence you could not see that was patiently studying the ground you were standing on, looking for the small mistake you had made. And there was something about being hunted like that, not shot at, but observed, that eats at a person in a way that mere danger does not. It changed how they lived. An army that knew a FAC might be overhead at any moment could never fully relax. It bred a permanent, exhausting vigilance. Cover every fire, bury every scrap. Move only under the trees. Take the long way, the hard way, the hidden way, always. Freeze when you hear the buzz, and do not move, and do not look up, because looking up shows a pale face against a dark jungle, and a face is a thing that can be seen from 300 feet. An entire army spent years living under that discipline, and the man enforcing it was one lonely pilot in a plane with a lawnmower engine who could not have hurt them if he had wanted to. And that, in the end, is the strangest fact of this whole story. The most feared aircraft over Vietnam, in the memory of the men who lived under it, was not the one that could do the most damage. It was the one that could see. Here is what the North Vietnamese Army finally understood about that little buzzing plane, and it is a lesson about war that goes far beyond Vietnam. For a generation, everyone had assumed that the terrible thing in the sky was the bomb, that the fear an Air Force produces comes from its destructive power, the tonnage, the explosives, the ability to erase. And that assumption is wrong, or at least it is only half right. The Americans discovered, and the North Vietnamese learned the hard way, that all that destructive power is worth almost nothing without one small, unglamorous thing. Someone has to see the target. Firepower without eyes is just noise. It is a man swinging a sledgehammer in a dark room. The FAC was the eyes, and that made him, in a very real sense, the most powerful aircraft in the sky, despite being the weakest. He carried no bombs, but he decided where every bomb went. He could not fire a shot, but a word from him could bring down more explosive power in 10 minutes than his little airplane weighed 1,000 times over. He was harmless, and he was the trigger for everything. The men below him understood this perfectly. That is why they feared the harmless plane more than the deadly ones. They were not afraid of what it could do. They were afraid of what it could see, because what it saw it could destroy by simply picking up a radio. That is why the sound was so much worse than the bombs. A bomb is an event. It happens, and it ends. But the drone of that little engine circling patiently in the dark above a column of men holding perfectly still, that was not an event. That was a question hanging in the air over them. Did he see us? and the men on that trail had to stand in the dark and wait to find out, unable to run, unable to fight, unable to do anything at all except hold still and listen to the sound of a man deciding whether they would live. That is a kind of power that has nothing to do with weapons, and it belonged to a young man in a fabric and aluminum airplane with a lawnmower engine, flying alone at night, unarmed, 300 feet over an army that would have given almost anything to kill him. And the lesson outlived the war. Every air force on Earth learned it and built on it. And it is why so much of modern warfare is now a contest over seeing rather than shooting. The drones circling over battlefields today, the satellites, the sensors, all of them are the descendants of that little plane and the man squinting down through its greenhouse windows, looking for a line of knocked down dew across a wet field at dawn. He proved something that has shaped war ever since. Find the target, and the destroying is the easy part. The whole game is in the looking. They were an army that had endured the heaviest bombing in the history of the world and kept walking. They were not frightened of destruction. They were frightened of being looked at, and the little plane never had to fire a shot. It only had to see them, and everything else followed. That is why 150 hard men stood frozen on a mountain trail in the dark, listening to a sound like a lawnmower, and were more afraid than the bombers had ever made them. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the strange, forgotten jobs that decided them, and the men who flew them on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today, and if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a pilot, an observer, a grunt on the ground who was saved by one, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.